So this next section of talks is on cuckoo surveys and monitoring. The first presenter is Stephanie Coates. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing. Yellow-billed Cuckoo Surveys and Research in Idaho. Take it away, Stephanie.
First, I want to say thanks for putting this symposium together. It's been really cool so far, and I've enjoyed hearing about cuckoos in places where there are a lot more than in Idaho. For the last 3 years, I've been leading the Intermountain Bird Observatory's Yellow-billed Cuckoo project, and today we'll be presenting about that work as well as some of the work from other partners across the state. And I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Jay at IBO and Tempe and Colleen at the Idaho Department of Fish and Game, and then Ethan Ellsworth at the BLM. I also wanted to try to put our research in Idaho into the Road to Recovery framework. At this point, most of our work is in phase 1, where we're assessing and learning about the species biology, as well as the social science side and specifics for Idaho. Some aspects of this phase are more developed, such as looking at occupancy and estimating breeding status, at least in the last few years. And we've also identified a lot of collaboration partners. I've listed other items in this phase that are either in progress or potential future directions, but I'll save talking about them until the end. Some of the ongoing or planned work falls into the next stages of the framework, specifically the Southern Idaho habitat model that Matt Johnson talked about earlier is being further refined and developed by Fish and Game and USGS, and that will be used to guide identification of priority restoration sites. There's also restoration work that's been initiated by the BLM and is partially informed by research outside of Idaho. And all of these sites with planned or ongoing restoration have higher monitoring priority, which feeds into evaluating the effectiveness of those efforts. So before the early 2000s, most of the detections were incidentals reported by birders, naturalists, and museum specimens. In the early 2000s, Reynolds and Hinckley used these records to select survey locations and conduct statewide surveys. And then in 2010 to 2012, Idaho Fish and Game and BLM conducted surveys and habitat modeling, which didn't always follow a common protocol. Beginning in 2017, which is the research that I'll be focusing this talk on, we began a survey collaboration between IBO, Idaho Department of Fish and Game, and BLM. And this was funded by the Fish and Wildlife Service and the BLM. We did site delineation in collaboration with local and regional partners. Again, that's back to the Matt Johnson habitat model that he discussed earlier. And then all of the occupancy data that we collect in these sites goes to Idaho Fish and Game and USGS for the Southern Idaho habitat model. We've also launched a couple of pilot projects that I'll talk about later on. Beginning in 2020, the Shoshone-Bannock tribes began monitoring as part of a larger species inventory project. Their monitoring follows the same U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service protocol, plus they've added on a more technologically advanced vegetation assessment in collaboration with a graduate student. So where are our main survey areas? Since 2017, most of the sites that we're focusing on are in southeast Idaho, and southern Idaho in general has the most abundant cuckoo habitat. So this map is divided into Idaho Fish and Game regions and BLM regions, and our 2 main survey areas are near Pocatello and then farther northeast by Idaho Falls. We also survey in the central part of the state where there used to be a proposed critical habitat, which did not get included into the designated critical habitat portion. And then we sometimes survey near Boise in the western part of the state. So southern Idaho riparian habitat is defined by these somewhat free-flowing rivers. Our surveys occur where they meander and are braided and form a lot of islands. The adjacent habitat is mostly agricultural with some sage steppe, especially in the Sun Valley area. and some intact bottomlands, especially in the Fort Hall Reservation. The land is a mix of BLM, private, and Shoshone-Bannock lands. Most areas that we survey are within the designated critical habitat. All of the now designated critical habitat falls in the Idaho, Pocatello and Idaho Falls regions. And the water throughout this area is managed for irrigation and human needs, and it's controlled at multiple dams and canals. At a finer scale, we have a cottonwood overstory, sometimes mixed with box elder and juniper and taller Russian olive. And our understory is a mix of dogwood and willows, skunk bush, gooseberry, and smaller saplings of the larger tree species. Our methods of access vary by site, and generally water levels are higher at the start of the season and gradually fall. However, this is not always the case, and I'll share an example of that later on. So our results so far, as you might expect, more survey effort most of the time leads to more detections. You can see that spike when Reynolds and Hinckley conducted their surveys, and then again in 2017 when we started this collaborative effort. Still, at maximum, we have less than 50 detections in any given year, and those detections are expected to represent less than 20 individual cuckoos total, and even fewer of those individuals are thought to be breeding pairs. So I'm going to focus on results from the two main survey areas, starting with the Idaho Falls region. This area includes the Upper Snake River, the main stem of the Snake, and the Henry's Fork, which is the branch off to the north. And we survey up to 34 sites here in a given season. This is almost 1,500 individual points, and we detect cuckoos at less than 0.5% of those survey points. At most, we've estimated there were 3 to 4 individual cuckoos here since 2018 in each year. However, this region is challenging because access can be very difficult. The Upper Snake in the main stem is too dangerous for kayaks, so we either jet boat or need private landowner permission to access sites. And the Henry's Fork sometimes has too little water for the canoe survey that we do in that part of it. So our surveys indicate low cuckoo numbers, but we do have a slight sampling bias for sites that are more accessible. In the Pocatello area, we surveyed between the American Falls Reservoir and upstream past Blackfoot, Idaho. And we survey fewer sites here because nearly all of them are kayak access, and it takes a while to paddle to the sites and then between the sites. But this is where we tend to see the most cuckoos now. You'll notice that we had a drop in detections in 2020 and then again in 2021 compared to the previous 2 years. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the river conditions those years and invite all of you to hypothesize with me about why we might be seeing those drops. So here I've included some visual and quantitative measures of water flow. The USGS chart, which is the bottom piece, in blue shows the discharge in cubic feet per second of the Snake River from mid-June to mid-August, which is our survey period. The orange triangles show median discharge for the last 60 years or so. This season started off with average numbers for us, 13 detections in the first survey window. And then a series of storms hit, and it became very cold, rainy, and water flow in the river spiked. This was at the beginning of visit 2. And this water that was flooding kind of spilled into the understory and inundated all of the leaf litter. After that, we had 1 incidental detection, which was heard from the kayak, and 1 detection by tribal biologists on the Fort Hall Reservation. So on average, we see a decrease in detections during visits 2 and 3, but it's not normally this drastic. We're tentatively hypothesizing that cuckoos arrived, had inadequate prey because of this leaf litter inundation and the cold, but we assume that they left to breed in more favorable conditions. So this year in 2021, the water flow was even more atypical for the season. This was a drought year, so we started with water levels that are usually found at the end of the season. We were portaging kayaks through back channels and scooting along in mud. And then that spike in water levels that you see in visit 2 isn't from storms, but from irrigation demands in an effort to fill the American Falls Reservoir by releasing water from the Palisades Dam in western Wyoming. We had a low number of detections in visit 1 and 2 and just 1 detection in visit 3. The main thing that was striking was that with the exception of a detection in visit 2 by a landowner, none of these occurred at the same site. And this suggests that cuckoos did not breed in this area in 2021. So beyond surveys, we started 2 pilot projects that I mentioned. In 2020, we tried some nest searching, and the goal of this was to collect feathers after the nests had become inactive and look at stable isotope analyses to gain some insight into where these Idaho breeding cuckoos might be spending other portions of their annual cycle. You might have guessed, but we have not had luck with this so far. This season, we also piloted an ARU project with the goal of eventually using ARUs to supplement in-person survey efforts so we could expand our temporal and geographic scope. And I haven't had a chance to look at these audio files yet. Outside of IBO, the BLM and Idaho Fish and Game, along with other partners, are working towards restoration of functioning native riparian habitat and hydrology. These projects aren't necessarily specifically for cuckoos, but they have been designed for many benefits, including improving potential cuckoo habitat. And they're also drawing on research from other regions where cuckoos occur in more frequency. So coming back to the Road to Recovery framework, there's still a lot to learn about cuckoos in Idaho, just at a basic species understanding level, especially understanding these population fluctuations that we're seeing and whether they are biologically meaningful at this small of a sample size, if we'll see longer term trends or patterns, if we have a longer term data set, and then also to identify important limiting factors, which could include prey availability or how prey availability might be impacted by agricultural or grazing practices, which are quite common in the area, or understanding how water flow is affecting the populations as well. And along with that, it's important to be looking at the movement and ecology as a whole, and especially how it connects cuckoos in Idaho with the dynamics of the Western population as a whole. On the social science side, we are looking to build broader regional partnerships and connect private landowners, hunters, fishers, and recreationists. And in general, looking at how these and other human dimensions overlap with the species distribution. We're making steps toward all of these goals, and the range-wide efforts that are planned for the near future are really exciting, especially for seeing how cuckoos in Idaho fit into these broader population dynamics. And the range-wide surveys that are going to be occurring soon. In the meantime, we're drawing heavily on knowledge from other parts of the cuckoo range, but truly recognize the importance of connecting our efforts through collaborations like these. And I want to thank all of the organizations and people that have contributed to this project and continue to make it possible.
Okay, so our next presenter is John Stanek with factors affecting detection of Western yellow-billed cuckoos during standardized surveys. Take it away, John.
All right. This is probability detection type data from 2008 to 2012, and also a separate 2-year study from, I think, 2011 and 2012. These presentations were developed quite a while ago, but I've mashed these 2 studies into one PowerPoint, so I'm going to go a little bit fast. I apologize, so buckle up, and hopefully we have time for questions. All right, so we all know that cuckoos are secretive, shy, difficult to detect, and they will actively evade detection if they know you're there. I've witnessed this. They are sneaky, crafty little birds. They've got large territories, and they've got a quick breeding cycle, which contributes to the difficulty in detecting these birds. part of which makes them so fun to study. So in this presentation, I'm going to look at two different studies and several factors that lead to the difficulty in detecting these birds, and also show that maybe their detectability is not as low as we believe. So real quick, so we've got two different studies that we're going to look at here. Results from two studies: an occupancy analysis detected from 2008 to 2012, 5 years of data, over 1,000 survey detections. And that will look at the probability of detecting the presence of the species within a site. And then the second half, we're going to look at the probability of detecting a cuckoo at a survey point. So two different scales of measurement here, and they kind of relate to each other. So the purpose of the survey objective, the survey protocol, is to detect the presence of a cuckoo, and hopefully we're all following the same methods by now. I think we are. And real quick, this is a slightly older survey period breakdown, but the first survey is conducted in the second half of June. The second survey is conducted in the first half of July. The third survey conducted in the second half of July. The fourth survey conducted in the first half of August, and the fifth survey is rarely done anymore. So the first thing that we look at here is that over 5 different years, the detectability of cuckoos within the first survey period is highly variable. The coefficient of variation is the standard deviation divided by the mean. It's a measure of variation in your data set. And we see that the variation in surveys conducted during the last 2 weeks of June were highly variable across these 5 years. And we know from telemetry data, geolocator data, GPS pinpoint data, and hopefully Calandra Stalley's satellite data that cuckoos they arrive late some years. They arrive late to the breeding season in June, sometimes not until July. So the high variation is probably dictated towards, in some years, birds arrive late, some years birds arrive early as May. And this probably has to do with the conditions encountered on migration, as we saw earlier when the dry tropical forests start to green up according to the rainfall. That could vary from year to year. Okay, so we looked at 5 years of data, and we looked at an occupancy analysis, and we stratified it in these 4 ways. And it was interesting, but we thought we could do better. We've got variable detection probabilities of occupancy across different types of sites. And so what we came to realize is that these sites, this analysis was looking at an open population of cuckoos, where cuckoos could be coming and going. To get a better understanding of the detectability of cuckoos, we wanted to assess a closed population of cuckoos. So we looked at our data, and we overlaid a random sample unit grid over our data set in GIS, and we looked at the 50 sample units that happen to contain 87 nests from across those 5 years of data. And what was the detection history and the probability to detect cuckoos in these sample units? There was a nest there, so it's as close as we could get to a closed population of cuckoos. So here it's a little different. We have a low probability of detection in the first survey period in June, but in July, the probability of detecting birds where a nest is located in the area somewhere randomly within that sample unit, we have a high probability of detecting the species on surveys 2 and 3, and August surveys, a low probability of detection again. And we know from telemetry data and other data sources that after the cuckoo's nest, the females will often leave before they'll leave the males to raise the young in some instances. So cuckoos, some of the cuckoos are leaving the area, we know from telemetry observations at this time. So if we look at sample units that had 2 nests, we see the probability of detecting the species. Occupancies analyses goes up. If we look at sample units with 3 and 4 nests, we just see that the probability of detecting the species in any given sample unit, any given sample period, survey period, just increases. And when we had 4 or more nests in a sample unit, the species was detected on every single survey. But more interesting is this scenario where you've got 1 nest within a 20-hectare sample unit. It's going to be the most common situation that you'll probably come across. So what's going on there? With our radio telemetry data, we were able to follow all these birds, find their nests, and we were able to track the nesting stages of these birds. So we see that nests are in the egg incubation phase most of the time and reach a peak of 20 nests in mid to early July. And then as the eggs hatch, we see a peak in the number of nests brooding young. And as those chicks fledge, we have parents with fledglings. So how does that relate to our previous data set? So overlaid over the same time frame, well, we know in survey period 1, a lot of our birds weren't here yet, hence the low detectability. In survey periods 2 and 3 corresponds nicely. When nests are active, they have eggs and young. So the probability of detecting adult cuckoos at this time seems fairly high at this period. And then when nests fledge and the birds start to move around and the fledglings are being taken care of by maybe just the male, maybe both adults, we again have a low probability of detecting the species within those sites. And we'll get into that a little bit more in the second analysis. But to summarize, in that study, on average, we detected cuckoos on 3 out of at least 4 surveys. So if a cuckoo was breeding in the sample unit, there were detections of the species on at least 3 different survey visits. Conversely, if we flip that data around and look at it a different way, the probability of not detecting the presence of cuckoos where breeding is actually occurring was less than 5%. So in our data set, there was a very high probability of detecting breeding cuckoos, detecting their presence within the sample unit. All right, so this is now transitioning to the second study. Surveys were conducted as usual, and at the same time, we tracked radio tag cuckoos with radio telemetry. So somebody was out there tracking cuckoos with radio telemetry, and they were actually hiding in the woods, hiding from the cuckoos, and they were hiding from the surveyors. So we monitored the cuckoo's response to the survey methods. We analyzed the results using a general linear mixed model, using cuckoo as a random effect. And also the flip side of that coin, we modeled the probability to detect cuckoos by surveyors, and the surveyor was the random effect in that one. So here's a selection of the variables that we assessed to look at probability of cuckoo response to our survey playbacks, but also a second model, probability of cuckoo detection of these responsive cuckoos. And we found distance and nest stage were super important in the probability of response. This is a cuckoo responding to the playback calls of the survey. Individual cuckoos did show some variation in their responsiveness. And in the probability of detection analysis, we found distance was also important. So how far the cuckoo was from the surveyor, and the response type, which we measured as loud, quiet, or silent responses. And surveyor was also important. It was found to be a significant random effect. Some surveyors were better than others. Here's a quick look at the data. So if we look at the responsive cuckoos in blue, we have cuckoos that were responsive, overlaid by distances, and we have non-responsive cuckoos. A lot of these non-responsive cuckoos were really far away from the surveyor. So here we modeled that, and this is one of our top models. And this is an average cuckoo, a cuckoo that's either transient or breeding. It's got eggs or chicks in the nest, and it has a high probability of response to the playbacks. If the surveyor was 100 meters away, the probability of response was about 88%. So cuckoos were very responsive, if they were transient, if they had nests, active nests with chicks or eggs. We found a difference though with chicks that had fledged. So nests with fledglings, the probability of responding to our survey protocol was significantly less, only around 60% probability of a bird to respond to our survey methods, and that's for birds 100 meters away from the surveyor. As you increase with distance from the surveyors, those adult birds with fledglings are just less and less responsive. And this helps explain why we see August surveys have a low probability of detection as well. On the flip side of that, we're going to look at the cuckoos that responded. How was the detectability of those birds by our surveyors? I'll start out by saying that if a cuckoo didn't respond to our surveys, it was never detected. No matter what the distance, if a cuckoo failed to respond to our survey playbacks, it was not detected. But here we see that some cuckoos that were even pretty close to our surveyors did not respond, and cuckoos were not detected. So a few close to cuckoos were not detected. And of the cuckoos that were detected, almost all of those were within 200 meters. If a bird was beyond 200 meters out, rarely was that responsive bird detected. Looking at the model, a loud call is a contact call or a cooing call, and the detectability of birds giving quiet calls, these are soft calls. This is your alarm call, which is a pretty quiet call. And a lot of our birds responded, but they responded with silent flight. And so these birds all moved some direction towards the surveyor with the speaker playing the calls, but they didn't call in response. And they didn't always move very far. Sometimes they only moved 10 or 20 meters in that direction, sometimes 40 meters, but birds that responded with silent flight had a low probability of detection. Now, on the plus side here, most of our cuckoos responded giving loud calls. These are birds that are transient, these are birds that are nesting. They usually responded with nice loud calls that carry a long ways. And the probability of detecting these loud calls 100 meters out was over 85%. So that's good. Now, birds with fledglings, so these birds generally in August, they showed a 50-50 response to respond with loud calls, but also silent flight. So these birds that have fledglings really stop caring about the surveyors. They stop caring about these other survey calls. They don't respond as often, and when they do respond, about half the time they respond with silent flight. So again, these August surveys yield a low probability of detection. So in summary, these results found that distance was pretty important in response and detection of cuckoos. So this comes into play with your survey layout within a site. The nesting stage we found was important to the response and detection of cuckoos. If the birds respond loud or soft or with silent flight, some cuckoos respond more than others, and quite frankly, some surveyors were better at detecting other birds than other surveyors. And looking at the occupancy results in summary, we found cuckoo movement in June, cuckoo movement in August, some birds have already left, affect your ability to detect the presence of birds on these occupancy surveys. Cuckoo density, if a sample unit had 1 nest versus 4 nests, you had a higher chance of detecting the species in your sample unit. Again, the breeding stage comes into play, and the breeding phenology. Are the birds breeding all at the same time, like we saw at the Bill Williams Refuge with the cicada talk, or are the birds showing breeding that's not synchronous, that's asynchronous, as we often see at the restoration sites? That's going to affect your detectability during an occupancy survey. All right, well, that was everything. This was a MSCP LCR study, and we had a lot of people involved in this work. So I went really fast. Be happy to answer questions if we have time.
We're going to try to hold questions to the end, and we might go into the break with those questions, but we do have a few in the chat.
Okay.
So I'll collect those for you for later. Thank you. That was a real doozy. I could tell. Okay, so next up, the next two presentations are from Nick Beauregard. The first one is development and assessment of targeted signal classifiers for passive acoustic monitoring of birds. So Nick, I think, yep, you should be able to share and everything.
Okay, just give me one moment here. And I'm actually gonna start with this other presentation, if that's okay with everybody. And can you see this and hear me okay?
Yes, you sound great. We can see it. It's perfect.
Okay, great. Yeah, I feel like this might be a better transition into the second talk, to kind of talk about the study area first and then get into the recorders. So yeah, thanks for having me. And this has been super fun so far. I have quite a bit to talk about, so I'll try to go as quickly as I can and not go over. The first thing I'm going to talk about is part of my dissertation research here at Northern Arizona University, looking at Western Yellow-billed Cuckoo breeding status and distribution in Southeast Arizona. So this is a pretty special region for birders and for cuckoos that we already know about. I love this map that, and this figure that I have here centered in the screen, made by Sky Island Alliance, and it shows the Sky Island region and how the Arizona-Mexico border kind of cuts that region directly in half between the southern Rocky Mountains and the Colorado Plateau and the northern Sierra Madre. And you can see it's just a major convergent zone of a number of ecological and biological communities, as well as gradients elevationally and climatologically. And so that has a huge effect on the processes that are going on throughout the region, and it affects cuckoo distribution, as we'll see. So I'm focusing only in the Arizona side of the Sky Islands region. So I'll just kind of dive into that. So we already know that there are major riparian areas that contain major cuckoo populations in the Sky Island region, such as the San Pedro River here in Mammoth, Arizona. You can see the Cottonwood Gallery Forest down the center, flanked by mesquite bosque, and a pretty wide floodplain there. So you can imagine doing cuckoo surveys there would be a big zigzag back and forth across the river all day. Another site here, Sonora Creek in Patagonia, Arizona, a bit higher elevation, a bit more diverse in terms of plants and tree composition, but again, a riparian woodland with mixed age, mixed size classes of these different tree species. So we already know that there's major populations of cuckoos along these riparian areas. But if you look at a map in eBird of cuckoo detections, you'll notice in the southwestern and southern part of the Sky Islands region, there's a whole lot of reports of cuckoos throughout that region in the mountains and foothills of these Sky Island mountains. So I guess the major question here is, what are they doing? Are they migrating? Are they stopping over and breeding? Until recently, we really didn't know much about it. There were a handful of nesting reports and documented nests throughout the region, but very few, especially compared to the number of detections that are being reported in eBird and by other surveyors such as Tucson Audubon Society and some contractors and consultants for various projects. They've collected a lot of survey data, but again, have documented very few nests. So back in 2016, 2017, when I was thinking about going to grad school, I got in touch with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service cuckoo lead, and we put together a proposal for a science support partnership grant through USGS. So I'm working with Charles Drost and Susan Sfera and my advisor, Dr. Tad Timer here at NAU, to investigate breeding status and distribution in this region. And I should say this grant that we were awarded, it included a number of other partners and collaborators that I'll try to mention throughout the talk. So it's a very multi-collaborative project involving a number of stakeholders and contributors. So what we're mainly looking at here is zero riparian and some non-riparian habitat in ephemeral and intermittent drainages in these mountain ranges and their foothills and some associated valleys where we historically haven't had a lot of cuckoo data or much knowledge of cuckoo occupancy. So the goals of the project, at least this part of the project, was to compile some historic data, like I mentioned, that Tucson Audubon data and other consultant data, as well as even further back historic data, as well as collect new data from a subset of sites in a subset of mountain ranges. And we chose some targeted and random sites to look for cuckoos. We use protocol surveys that we've already talked about and that you all are very familiar with, I'm sure, but we also included a lot of nest searching effort. And so a number of sites received protocol surveys and nest searching, and then a number of sites we just only nest searched because of mostly accessibility and things like that. Some of these sites are pretty remote and we can't quite get there 4 or more times in a year. And I should mention that this project is heavily volunteer-based and community scientist based. We had a huge amount of contribution from volunteers, such as these folks in our cuckoo training in 2018 that we did down in Patagonia, Arizona. So the majority of the folks in this photo are, well, first of all, they're looking at a nest from the previous year that I'm standing directly under. And the majority of these folks are contributing to this project or did contribute to this project in one way or another as a volunteer or as a collaborator with partner organizations. So we got a big team of collaborators and volunteers out in the field. And to give you an idea of where we were working, this map here just shows the the public lands of southeastern Arizona. You can see that the Coronado National Forest is split up into a number of parcels that are covering these different mountain ranges throughout the region, south of the Gila River and east and west of the San Pedro River. Our study mostly focused on the Santa Catalina Mountains and Rincon Mountains that include Saguaro National Park, as well as the southern and southwestern portion of the Sky Islands that includes Buenos Aires National Wildlife Refuge and a number of mountain ranges and sub-ranges in the Atascosa Highlands and Santa Rita Mountains and Patagonia, Huachuca, and Whetstone Mountains, and so on. We didn't focus so much east of the San Pedro River, mostly due to just limited resources, accessibility. This is a huge region. It takes a long time to drive around, and I'm only one student, and our volunteers, we couldn't push them too hard to get out to all these various places. There is some data available from some of those regions that I'll show you in a minute, but we mostly wanted to focus on these areas that I've circled because that's where the bulk of the eBird detections and other historic data come from. So we wanted to really get in there and confirm or document what's really going on. So I'll just jump right into the results here. We compiled data from historic data and collected new data from a total of 171 sites in the broader Sky Islands region. So 45 of those sites did have documented breeding with a total of 57 breeding locations or territories. And we documented breeding using criteria including a nest building, copulation, or an observation of a fledgling. So sometimes we would find a fledgling, but not the nest, but we could tell by the age of the fledgling that it can't fly very far, and therefore the nest must have been, within a few hundred meters, most likely. So while we don't have exact locations of nesting for those individual birds, we can at least say that the site itself was occupied. We additionally documented 46 more occupied sites, including historic data and new data. There is a total of 91 occupied or breeding sites. There were 22 unoccupied sites with detections. So that means there was either one detection early in the season or late in the season on one survey, which doesn't count as being occupied. Additionally, there were 58 unoccupied sites with no detections that we collected data for. And just to give you an idea of the elevation range that we're talking about, and I'll talk a little bit more about habitat in a minute, but most of these sites were between 2,000 and 6,000 feet elevation. So kind of going up from the Tucson Basin into the just below the pine, like the ponderosa pine tree line in the mountains. So this is a map of the Sky Islands region with all of our data depicted. You can see that in the region that I'd mentioned earlier, the Tucson region and the kind of southern and southwestern region, that's where the bulk of our documented occupied sites are. So especially down in the Patagonia Mountains, Santa Rita Mountains, and into the Atascosa Highlands and Altar Valley of Buenos Aires Wildlife Refuge, we found cuckoos pretty much all over the place. In some cases, they just seem to be dripping from the trees. Further north into the Rincon Mountains and Santa Catalina Mountains, we did document breeding for the first time in Saguaro National Park and some other drainages that have not previously been known to host cuckoos. I should mention that we tried to collect more data from the Catalina Mountains, but the Bighorn fire a couple years back that really torched that entire mountain range prevented us from collecting any data in that year that we had planned on collecting more data. So that was a huge bummer for us, but we do hold out hope that we'll be able to get back in there at some point and see if there's any cuckoos in the areas recovering from the fire. There, like I mentioned earlier, though, there is some data east of the San Pedro River in the Chiricahua Mountains and Dragoon Mountains, especially, where in the Dragoon Mountains, we did have a volunteer who identified a juvenile in one of the drainages in the eastern Dragoon Mountains, and a biological consultant found an occupied territory on the west side of the Dragoon Mountains. In the Chiricahua Mountains, there have been a number of reports over the years, but we haven't been able to document breeding. I'll mention that most of the Chiricahua mountain range, especially where the surveys have taken place, is at higher elevation than those sites in the western portion of the Sky Island. So it could be that there are occupied drainages in the Chiricahua Mountains, but that they are occurring at lower elevations, which typically means they're on private ranching land or otherwise private land that might not be very accessible for surveyors to get into. So don't take this quite at face value. There's plenty of caveats and survey biases and so on that are influencing this overall distribution of points on the map. But the biggest takeaway here, in my opinion, is just that these all these green dots in the western portion of the Sky Islands region, especially south of Tucson, we almost couldn't not find cuckoos in some of these sites. And so I just want to kind of give you a brief look at what some of these sites look like. I'll mention, though, that you really can't get a feel for it until you get down there and see these drainages for yourself. So if you have never been to southeastern Arizona, I recommend making a trip if you can, and checking out some of these drainages. But here's Smith Canyon, which I showed you earlier with the volunteers in it. And you can see that this is kind of a rolling drainage, kind of mellow in a lot of ways, not very steep sided and really not very wooded in particular, but you can just see how green this is. So this is mid-monsoon season at peak green up, and the entire landscape from the uplands and the grasslands all the way down to the drainage bottom where it's mostly filled with oak and mesquite is just lush and green. And so going back to this photo, this tree behind the volunteers and the training participants, this is a big oak tree that's probably 2.5 feet at DBH. So it's a big old tree, and the tree that I'm standing under when I take this photo is about the same size, and that's where the nest was the year previous. And so even though there's no cottonwoods or really much of anything else for riparian tree species in this drainage, the oak trees and the mesquite trees grow pretty robust here. And in some ways, it seems like those trees are making up for the riparian species that would otherwise be present in cuckoo habitat. And I should mention that all this kind of brown grass that you see in front of these folks, this is in June or early July. And so if you came back a few weeks later, mid-monsoon, especially like a year like 2021, where it was almost a record monsoon year, it was almost as tall as these individuals with grass and herbaceous growth. So it comes in really strong, just like Nick mentioned earlier in his previous talk about some of the Gran Chaco and wintering grounds green up areas. I couldn't help but think it's almost the same phenomenon going on here between the dry season and the wet season with monsoons. And so here's another site, Stevens Canyon. It's actually kind of next door to Smith Canyon in the Santa Rita Mountains. Again, you can see the oak trees are pretty robust and large. The mesquite are not so large up here. And you can actually see the ephemeral wash going through kind of the bottom. It's barely a wash at all. This is a very minor drainage basin, but we found cuckoos breeding here. And you can see it's actually quite open overall, but there is a mixed height composition and structure going on in this site, and you can see how cuckoos might enjoy that based on what you know about riparian habitat preferences. And again, it's a very lush and green site. Nearby in the Patagonia Mountains, Willow Springs Canyon, another ephemeral drainage. You can see that there's, again, some big, robust oak trees. There's also some herbaceous growth along this wash. There's grape growing over some of the shrubs. There's also evidence of a fire, which occurred, I think, back in 2017 or 2016. And I found a nest in this drainage in a tree that had been scarred from the fire the previous year, but the tree was still alive and relatively healthy. So that just goes to show that in these kind of low intensity fires, the cuckoos might actually be able to respond okay. And again, I should mention it was a very low intensity fire. It almost behaved like a prescribed burn, according to the Forest Service folks I talked to. So on the flip side, if it were a high intensity fire, you can imagine this habitat might just be completely wiped out. But it was very interesting to see that cuckoos were breeding post fire just a year later. And then getting a little bit more into the kind of transition between non-riparian or zero riparian and riparian is Adobe Canyon, again, kind of nearby across the Sonora Creek Valley in the Santa Rita Mountains. So this is a pretty major drainage off the Santa Rita Mountains, and it's very dense with oak and again, a lot of kind of zero riparian species like hackberry, walnut, etc. that really make for very complex habitat. And every year that we've surveyed here, we just find a mess of cuckoos all over the place in this drainage. But again, this is a ephemeral wash. It only runs, I think the only time I know about it running was this past year in 2021, and I've never seen it run in previous years, and I've been going to the site for a few years now. So it's an ephemeral wash. There's no perennial water in the vicinity, but it's a very lush and structurally complex site that we consistently find cuckoos in. One more for you, or actually two more real quick. Rock Corral Canyon and the Atascosa Highlands. You can see how beautiful some of these field sites are. I'm certainly grateful to have the opportunity to survey in these areas. This is one of our volunteers who surveyed with me. And again, you can just see how lush the entire mountain range is. Normally those hillsides are pretty brown most of the year, but again, mid-monsoon season, the whole site becomes green, and it's almost indistinguishable between the drainage bottom and the uplands. And we consistently found cuckoos foraging up near those cliffs, not the furthest cliffs away, but in the cliffs nearby in the ocotillo and some other thorn scrub species like kidney wood. So again, a very lush site that we found cuckoos in. And one of the driest places, although there's water in this photo, is the Saguaro National Park and the Rincon Creek watershed. This is you can see just the Saguaro and Sonoran Desert immediately flanking this ephemeral wash that happens to be in flood right now. And just below this pool, in the small patch of ash trees and mesquite that you can see downstream, is where a volunteer found a nest just this year in 2021. And so this kind of shows you more of the drier xeric extreme of some of these sites. So to kind of look at this habitat on kind of a categorical and qualitative scale, we didn't take fine scale habitat metrics, I should say. So we kind of looked at this in a more remote sensing platform. So we use landfire data here to look at the primary habitat associations of our sites. And you can see that the targeted and random sites show pretty consistent occupancy between these habitat types. Although this warm desert riparian, we had way more targeted sites than random. And you can imagine that's because when you're just kind of using your best judgment to find cuckoos, you're going to kind of go towards more riparian areas that you find in the mountains. But I should also say that this warm desert riparian landfire habitat association it's not the most accurate for a lot of these sites. I noticed that a lot of the sites that are classified as this really don't contain a lot of riparian vegetation overall, especially compared to major riparian areas like the San Pedro River or Sonora Creek or Santa Cruz River. In most cases, they contain narrow bands of kind of scraggly and not very robust riparian species that might not even include cottonwood or willow. They might just be hackberry or ash or walnut. But you can see we have the majority of our sites in Madrean Encinal or Madrean oak woodland, semi-desert grassland, mesquite upland, et cetera, going down into kind of the Sonora and Palo Verde cacti habitat type. So again, these are kind of coarse associations, but it does give us a sense of what's going on here, at least in some capacity. And so just kind of going through these results a bit more, some of the interesting findings were that we were able to find nests in a number of new or uncommon trees, such as oak, juniper, ash, yew leaf, willow, hackberry, acacia, and mesquite, which is probably not that uncommon, but we found almost no nests in willow or I should say Gooding's willow or cottonwood or sycamore or a number of other riparian species. They often located their nests in smaller adjacent trees, such as these smaller oaks and junipers, even if there were larger riparian species nearby. We also had some first nesting records in Saguaro National Park, like I mentioned, and several other mountain ranges. And we found breeding and detections into September in some sites, which has been documented elsewhere in riparian areas, but we weren't necessarily expecting so much of that in southeastern Arizona. And one thing that was very interesting, in my opinion, was that a lot of the nests and activity were away from the drainage bottom itself. So some of these drainages are kind of canyonous. And like I mentioned earlier, we would find them foraging up on the hillsides. And I've even found a few nests up to 100 meters away from the drainage bottom up on a hillside. And, you know, I heard a call from up there and never expected the nest to be up there, but it kept calling and I followed it and found the nest. So what that kind of tells to me is that maybe we should be broadening the scope of where we're looking for cuckoos in these types of habitats and not necessarily focusing on the densest habitat in the drainage bottom. And I would say most importantly, and what a lot of folks might be interested in, is that a lot of these sites have a strong monsoon green up, like we mentioned earlier. And so there's a lot of tall, dense herbaceous undergrowth, green up of spring deciduous oak trees. So some of these oak species lose their leaves in spring and early summer and look like they're about to die. And then when the monsoons hit, they all of a sudden leaf out and green up in a huge way. And there's always been an abundance of insects like caterpillars, orthopterans, and cicadas at most of these sites, which we weren't able to quantify in any meaningful way, but I think there's a lot of opportunity for more study in that area. And so talking about this monsoon impact or influence, I just want to show you a brief kind of case study. So here's the Santa Rita Mountains that you might be familiar with in southeastern Arizona. And all the purple dots represent occupied sites that we located, and the white dots represent unoccupied sites. And if you look at some of the remote sensing layers, like for instance, the topographic wetness index, this is a great way to see within the drainage basins where these sites are located. So you notice that there's a lot of cuckoos in kind of like the middle range of these drainage basins, and not so much up into the high country. And then if you look at some Ndvi data, this is the amplitude, the seasonal amplitude of Ndvi. So it's not the maximum Ndvi values. It's not the maximum green up. It's the amplitude of green up from the beginning of the season to the end of the season. And so what this really shows is the amplitude of green up in relation to that monsoon precipitation. And so you can see that a lot of these purple dots are falling out right in some of the greenest parts of that amplitude. Whereas the top of the mountain, which is evergreen forest, it's not going to actually have much of an amplitude of green up because it's already green in the spring and year round. And so this allows us to kind of differentiate these high elevation habitats that might be very green and have high Ndvi signatures from these lower elevations that are more responsive to the monsoon precipitation for that green up. And so these are just some variables that we're playing around with some habitat modeling that I'm working on. And so I guess I'll just leave it at that we're still working on that. A few more implications. I think I'm going over, so I'm just going to try to wrap this up real quick here. Basically, they're breeding in these areas. We know that ephemeral drainages, many habitat configurations, composition structures. There's a lot more work that needs to be done to quantify and describe the habitat. We didn't get a great sense of nest success because a lot of these nests were in very remote areas that we couldn't monitor. but we definitely found a number of fledglings and juveniles indicating some level of success. We did notice that occupancy varied between years in some of these sites, and more, we should say that more study is needed to determine broader distribution within this broader region, especially down into Mexico and elsewhere in the Sky Islands. And we don't know much about the connectivity between riparian areas and these upland areas. And I'm just going to kind of skip this, but the last thing I do really want to say, though, is that, again, I want to repeat that volunteer and community scientist contributions and a lot of the collaborations really made this a successful project and really made my PhD work a lot easier to manage. So I have a lot of acknowledgements here, some names to list, and then a lot of these partner organizations with the Forest Service, Arizona Field Ornithologists, USGS Park Service, Borderlands Restoration, Tucson Audubon, and Audubon, Arizona in particular contributed a lot. So I'll just leave it at that. And here's my email address, and then I'll kind of move into the next one, I guess, if that's okay.
Of course, for the purpose of time, can we just crunch it a little bit more?
Yeah, sorry.
We have plenty of time, but you're cool.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll try to whip through the next one, even though there's more slides in it. I apologize. So, okay, let's talk about recorders and cuckoo vocalizations. So this is a second chapter or another chapter in my dissertation. And again, it was a part of this Southern Arizona cuckoo study, same funding source, USGS and Fish and Wildlife. It was another one of our objectives. I'll just mention that we use wildlife acoustics recorders, or ARUs, which I'll be referring to them as, and Kaleidoscope Pro to process the acoustic data. So that's really what I'm talking about when I'm getting into the analysis. And so I just want to kind of mention briefly, and this is what I'll try to skip over since it's not super cuckoo related, but I think this is important and it's a big part of my dissertation, is that there's kind of two steps to acoustic monitoring. The first is going out and collecting the data, right? So you put these recorders out, they're great. They have all sorts of customizable schedules. You can put them in remote areas and set it and forget it. They have efficient battery life. You have this permanent data record. It's amazing. The problem is processing the data. I have over a dozen terabytes of acoustic data, and there's no way that I can sit and manually scan through all of that data to find all the cuckoo vocalizations. So what we use is a classifier, which is used to detect a target signal, and it uses machine learning methods to basically isolate the target signal based on a model of the signal, and you have to kind of train that signal. So it's semi-automated. You know, there's a manual labor aspect of it, but the idea is it's going to be more efficient to use a classifier than to manually scan all the data yourself to find your vocalizations. And so just this conceptual diagram over here on the right, you can see the target signal is going to be kind of in this broader model represented by data from examples of that target signal. And then you have background noise, which is going to be the other signals in the environment, other birds, other frogs, whatever you got, planes, things like that. And so data is sorted into clusters. So you have your training data, you do a cluster analysis. It tries to sort them based on similarity, but it's never that effective in the first go around. And so you do a manual review, which essentially tells the classifier where it went wrong, and then you train that classifier with that manual review, and then you end up with your advanced classifier, which contains the statistical model of that training data. And then I'm going to kind of skip through this really quickly, but the idea here is you use that classifier to process new data, and then you end up with your true positives. Let's say these green birds are our cuckoos. Those are the true positives in the cluster that we want them to be in, the one that we named cuckoo. But you also have some false negatives, some misses, and then you have some false positives, some birds that aren't cuckoos that are misclassified as such by the classifier. So it's never going to be perfect, but the idea here is that you can try to train your classifier to be increasingly accurate. And so I think I'm just going to kind of blow through this a bit real quick. So basically, most classifiers are going to have some relatively poor performance, especially if the songs are variable and difficult to sort. And so in the case of the classifiers I built, I know this is a whole lot of data to put in front of you, and I apologize, but really just focusing in on how I basically retrained this classifier multiple times to improve the recall, which is the proportion of actual cuckoo calls in the data set that were identified. And so by training it 4 times, I was able to get that true positive rate up to 60%, meaning 60% of the cuckoo calls in the data set were accurately reported as such, which also means 40% were missed. But 60% is actually pretty good compared to a lot of other papers out there that have used classifiers, not just in Kaleidoscope, but elsewhere. And so what I did for cuckoos in the study design here is we had 5 sites. We had 4 recorders at each site along a transect spaced 500 meters apart. We had them recording every day continuously from 4 a.m. to 11 a.m. And we also ran protocol surveys at these sites. And we actually did 6 surveys going into early September. So again, yeah, 2-kilometer transect, 500 meters apart. And I chose 500 meters, you might remember, because in the occupancy rubric in the protocol, it's because we use 500 meters as a measure of a territory size, right? So detections have to be within 500 meters to be considered part of that territory. So the idea here is I'm trying to apply the spatial and temporal criteria for estimating occupancy at a site from protocol surveys to the recorders, meaning if cuckoos are detected on a recorder, on a single recorder, at least twice, with those detections being a minimum of 10 days apart, well, then that kind of meets the criteria of occupancy according to the rubric in the protocol for protocol surveys. And so I'm trying to apply these criteria to the recorders themselves and that acoustic data. Here's just a few spectrograms of some of the calls. I just want to point out that these coo calls are very reliably consistent and similar. Even though these might look different, you can see the spacing is pretty similar in the syllables and so on. And they also occur in frequency ranges that are outside of most other bird calls of other species. So that's great. That allows the classifier to pick up those calls pretty effectively. These alarm calls are also pretty consistent and similar across the board. But here's some contact calls that are kind of, I mean, if you have a lot of experience with cuckoos in the field, you know that contact calls and cuckoo vocalizations generally can be pretty variable. And same with kelp calls. Here's a bunch of kelp calls. And again, they're kind of variable across the board. So that's not so great for classifier performance, because the machine learning algorithm is not going to easily see these 2 examples and know that they're the same species. There's a lot of variation there. So that can really affect classifier performance. But here's some results though from our 5 sites. You can see that we found a lot of coo calls, a good amount of contact calls, a lot of calls generally, and they're distributed across these 5 sites in an interesting way that I'll talk about real quick. Basically, Box Canyon had not a lot of detections, but it's a box canyon. It's basically a narrow slot canyon, so that almost definitely affected the attenuation and the survey coverage, or the range of the recorders being blocked by canyon walls and so on. Gardner Canyon, Las Quijas Wash, both of these sites are broad, open floodplains, lots of range for those recorders, so it makes sense that they would be detecting a lot of cuckoos. You can also see that they had a lot of survey detections as well. Stevens Canyon had very few detections in one breeding territory, and not a whole lot of detections with recorders, although enough to call that site occupied under that rubric. Whereas Hunter Canyon had 2 vocalizations detected, also 2 survey detections. I should note that those survey detections were on one single survey, and therefore it was not classified as occupied. And the recorder vocalizations were from that same survey period as well, so not occupied, and we found no further evidence of breeding. Here's a handful of figures, and this kind of shows detection rates across the sites. Each color bar is a different site. I apologize that it might be a lot to look at in just the brief time we have, so I'm happy to send this to folks afterwards if you're interested in taking a closer look. But this is just comparing the recorder results to the actual protocol survey results. So the y-axes are going to be different, and then the survey periods, I should mention, are kind of made up, whereas survey period 0 is prior to June 15th, so June 1st to June 15th, and then we did 2A, 2B for July and 3A, 3B for August, and then one survey in September. But again, you can see that there's some pretty high numbers in some sites and some low numbers in some other sites that kind of go back to what I was talking about. We can see here across survey periods, the call types are showing different trends. So the contact call, and I should mention, I forgot to mention, the contact call is basically a combination of all the CALP, the alarm, and the contact call. And they peak early in the season, then start to go down, whereas the coup calls kind of peak a little bit later, go down, and then peak again. And that kind of indicates maybe that second round of breeding by females, or at least interest in breeding. And then this is just the number of days with each call type per survey period. So nothing crazy to see here, just it's pretty consistent with when you would expect cuckoos to be surveying or calling. And then this is just looking at calls per hour. And this can inform some of the timing of when you would use recorders. So you can see there tends to be a peak early in that morning, just like you would expect with most birds. Did find some weird calls, such as this CALP call turning into a coup call. I wish I could play it back to you. I do have the file available if anyone wants to hear it. And I'd be curious if anyone's ever heard this in the field, where like a CALP or a contact call starts to morph into a coup call, or vice versa. And then there's also, just like I mentioned earlier, a lot of variation in these calls where it's kind of hard to call it a contact or a CALP or an alarm or a contact, and so on. And then there's also the issue of drone noise down here by the border that we noticed, which can impact detection rates. So a little bit, or quite a bit, to talk about here. So I just want to kind of go through it real quick. Basically, classifier performance is variable, might be related to things like that, anthrophony and geophony, which are the like rain and drones and planes and things like that, and also the variation within those call types. We had more coups than contact calls, but they cooed on fewer days. And then, like we mentioned earlier, there is the possibility of looking at things like cicada abundance through recorders. So you can maybe use this data to get some more interesting information out of those sites. And we don't know a whole lot about the biological function of the call types, except for what Shannon told us earlier, which is great information, but I think there's still a lot more study to be done on the other call types, and that might give us a better interpretation of the data. And I should say that I know a lot of other folks are interested in using recorders and using other methods like convolutional neural networking, which tends to have a higher success rate overall, but is also a bit more challenging and advanced. But this technology is rapidly advancing, so I'm sure it won't be long before my research is actually kind of moot and obsolete. But my aim here is to try to get folks started, or at least give people guidance on how to get started with monitoring, especially if you're using the same software and hardware that I am. All right, so I apologize that I went so long. Again, same folks I want to thank as always, and same volunteer contributions as well. And here's my contact info if you want to talk more about it. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Nick. Perfect. So we have about 20 minutes, nice, for a panel discussion with these last survey and monitoring speakers. So I'm going to exit this. So let's see. We got a couple of thanks to Nick. Do we have any questions? Let's see.
I have a question for Nick.
Shoot.
Hey, Nick, I think I recall you saying that you conducted surveys, standard surveys, in the same areas where you had ARUs placed.
Yes.
Were you able to cross-reference cuckoos detected by the people to determine how the distance that an ARU can detect a cuckoo?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I do have some of that data, and I think what I would say is we don't have that data in exactly the same way that you're talking about it. What I do have is the exact locations of where we did playback at each point in relation to the recorder. So I could look at how far away the playback was picked up by the recorder. And I get, I do have the at least estimated locations of the cuckoos based on the distance and bearing estimation. So I can do an estimate of those detections, those vocalizations from the recorder and see if they were picked up or not. But the playback calls, I think, are the easiest to do that analysis with, because we know exactly where that playback was coming from and how loud it was as well, because we have, we know the decibel level of our speakers. And so I've been meaning to kind of get at that. So because we haven't really looked at exactly what the range of each individual recorder is and how that varies across sites. We do know that, these more narrow canyons or densely vegetated sites are going to obviously have higher attenuation rates, and therefore less coverage and less range overall.
Cool. I think people would be interested in hearing about that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I had a question for John. I was wondering if you had you had a number of nests and related that to the detection probability. Were there any areas that did not have any sampling units that did not have nests?
In the first half of my talk, all of the sample units had a nest, and the nest was in a random, the grid was randomly overlaid over our data set. So the nest was not necessarily in the center of the sample unit. A lot of times it was near an edge. And so, yes, we always had nests in the sample unit. And I didn't analyze the other half of that data, sample units without nests. I didn't look at that, if that answers your question.
That was what I was asking, yes. Yeah, because I'm wondering, there's a lot of people surveying in areas that may not have nests, may be birds moving through, or nests may be at a much greater larger home ranges, lower density of cuckoos, and therefore they're going to have a different probability of detection because there's fewer birds and more sampling units that don't have cuckoos in them. So that's a useful comparison. But I know on those restoration sites, there's so many cuckoos out there. It's actually the opposite problem, having areas that don't have cuckoos rather than areas that do.
Yeah, at least back in the day.
Right.
Yeah, that's
right.
interesting. I hadn't considered analyzing the data that way, and it's been years since I looked at it, but maybe that would be useful.
It would, like I say, there's a lot of folks, from the Idaho presentation and others, there's a lot of folks working in areas with much lower densities of cuckoos, and therefore they're going to see a lot of these things may be somewhat different. So detection rates may be lower, all of those. So might be something worth considering looking at.
Yeah, and that's why I focused on the sample units that only had one nest. And after that, it kind of seemed like you were looking at, or I would be looking at transient cuckoos, and the detection probabilities would be significant lower and not great. But you're right.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have a comment for Nick, which is fantastic information. Nick, would you be willing to share your dissertation with us? This is fascinating research. If it's not ready, please share for this working group when it's available.
Yeah, absolutely. If anyone here has done a dissertation, they probably know how tough it is to finish, and I'm working on that right now. I still have maybe up to another year left of writing some of this up, but I know some of you have also emailed me directly in the past asking if my papers are published, and they're not yet, but keep emailing me because that's some of the best motivation for me to finish. But I'll definitely share some drafts and this, these presentations and some other data to anyone who's interested, and just get in touch with me, and I'm happy to coordinate on that and share what I have.
Awesome. Okay, so this question is from Jay, and Jay is saying, I may have missed it, but is breeding phenology different between the foothills and nearby riparian areas?
That's a great question, and that's kind of what I was kind of getting into, and we're not so sure what the connection is between these riparian areas and the foothill and mountain populations. We don't know if, for instance, they're breeding first in the riparian areas and then moving into the mountains for a second clutch when it gets greener. I would say that most of our nests we found during like peak monsoon season, but there's also the survey bias of just being out in the field the most at that time. We did find plenty of birds in our sites, you know, as early as mid-June, just like you would expect in riparian areas. So it seems like there's not a whole lot of difference necessarily, or at least in terms of what we've been able to see in terms for, you know, the phenology of breeding between these different habitat types. Again, we need to do more research on that. So I'd love to start pursuing that, or you know, help someone else pursue that. It's definitely an important question to be asking. And I'm also hoping that maybe some of the satellite tracking and so on might help us get at that, where they're moving to and from.
Mary just interjected that it could potentially be a great MODIS project using life tags.
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be exciting.
Okay. So we have a question for Kristen Dillon. Are you still here? I hope you are.
I am.
See you. Okay. What do you think drives the cuckoo preference for Gooding's willow for your sites?
It's just a bit more prey, more canopy closure, water, or something else. Honestly, I think it's probably a little bit of a combination of all of those things. I think structurally, kind of that mid-age Gooding's willow provides just gorgeous cover and structure for cuckoos for nesting habitat. In addition, if you think about what the kind of larger habitat looks like in areas where there's a lot of Gooding's willow, there tends to be a really high water table. We often have flooding, at least for part of the season, kind of a more dynamic hydrologic cycle. Related to that, again, we don't have information on prey, but I would not be surprised if it was also somewhere where there is a larger prey base, just thinking about what it's like when I'm out in the field and kind of that wetter, lusher, more dense Gooding's willow habitat compared to the somewhat more arid cottonwood habitat. It does kind of seem like it's an overall richer system as far as the other, you know, invertebrates that are present, and overall variety of species that you find there. So I would imagine it's kind of a combination of all of those things that make it pretty highly suitable nesting habitat for cuckoos.
Awesome. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any questions for any of the morning presenters, or Stephanie, John, or Nick? Okay.
Actually, just an observation on the Sacramento River. We also found in the late 80s that the presence of that young woody vegetation was one of the predictors, in addition to habitat size, for the presence of yellow-billed cuckoos. So we were starting to see that again back in the late 80s. So, yeah, it's been a process, but definitely it was something that we were starting to know back then. But of course, weren't doing nest searches thing very much. So anyway, just interesting to see the how important that habitat is. So great research.
Linnea, did you want to say something?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was just going to say that all of these talks have been fantastic, and I'm so appreciative because there's been so much great information confirming some, you know, things that I'm seeing in the field and we've been hearing about now, but also just all kinds of new information too. So it was just super. So thank you, everybody.
Agreed. It's been really excellent. So we do have one more question for Kristen Dillon, and just kidding, we answered this one. that's all of the questions, it seems, for the people that are presently here. Great. So, yep, go ahead, Jenna.
Sorry, I had another question for a morning session person, Nick.
I don't
Davies.
think he's here anymore.
Oh man, I missed my opportunity. Okay, I'll shoot him an email.
There's been a
Thank you.
couple. Actually, can I give those to you so you can just send it to him?
Yes, of course.
Perfect. Awesome. Okay, so it looks like we're going to enter our break a little bit early. Let's meet back here at about 3:25. Happy break, everybody.